Remember, the format that we've been requested to follow is filling out a card and submitting it for a question.
Thank you, Curt. You have a lot of to ask about. We have a question from a family that's house hunting for their parents. They have a family, and they're having a problem finding affordable housing because the entry-level price in Congress Park is about $600. With a limited stock of duplexes, we're stuck with no options. It sounds like character home preservation programs will be attainable. When will this come online?
So the character home program is that recommendation that I mentioned before about adding one additional unit on certain properties as a way, as long as the house is preserved. So that's the question, is when can we expect that to actually be encoded in zoning? And so this was a recommendation for the entire city in Blueprint Denver. And that's actually how this recommendation should be implemented, because what we don't want to do is disproportionately affect the housing market only in one area, one neighborhood. We want to actually change these standards in the entire city. That means every neighborhood will have some version of this rule. So we customize it. Like I said, we're customizing it for Congress Park because it's historic. But every neighborhood will have some version of integrating in these additional units. That project is kicking off this year. So that is a project to change the zoning code regulations. And the East Central Plan will help guide that project as it unfolds. And so the way zoning works is zoning is required by law to follow existing adopted plan guidance. So the East Central Plan will help guide that project. And so that project will probably take at least a year and a half. It hasn't kicked off yet, but will kick off this year. So the soonest that some of these zoning standards will come into place, I would think, is still at least about 2 years out.
We've had several questions about community benefits that were brought up. What really is in the plan that would make developers actualize these things? And why do you feel if we have this ongoing growth coming that developers should be given tax benefits and incentives at all?
So, a couple things, and I appreciate that question. Because, I mean, I think behind that question is a skepticism, right? And, well, most development companies are private businesses and they're about to achieve a profit. Right? So that's true, and we have to recognize that. And so if we don't create any public policies to provide something that there is no market for in terms of maximizing your profits, and that means publicly accessible open space or affordable housing oftentimes, we need to recognize that. And so the approach with community benefits is an incentive approach. And we get asked the question, why isn't it just required of every property, regardless of what their height is or their proposed height is? And there are some challenges, and one has to do with state law. There are some issues with state law that make it very difficult, if not impossible, for municipalities to require affordable housing in every single project that's considered rent neutral. And so we're working under an incentive strategy where we're saying, okay, you can develop under your current property rights. So if you're currently zoned 3 stories, you have a right today. You might have bought the property and paid the price of those rights. And so you should be able to use those rights and develop a 3-story building if you want to develop a 3-story building. But if you are interested and you meet criteria again of a site that we think is compatible to go more than your existing entitlements, then you are required to enter into a binding agreement with the city on a certain percentage of units that have to be affordable. And we also get the question, well, how many units? What's the percentage? That's a question that has to be answered in the regulatory process, and that means when we're drafting those actual regulations, that question will be answered. What we were saying at a guiding policy level is that that has to occur, and they have to be significant and meaningful and reflect the values that we've heard through this process, which means it has to be income restricted, there has to be some percentage of income restricted units, or you have to do one of these other community benefits that we've identified, like saving a historic building that's under threat, that we think is eligible for preservation, or providing significant public community open space. So I think that answers, hopefully, the question, but please follow up if I did.
You did a good job, but I'm having trouble with the enforcement part. Are there going to be several folks have asked what design guidelines will be in the plan, and can you make those available for us to see? Who will be the ultimate enforcer of this, or is it going to be on the neighborhoods?
Good clarification. Not on the neighborhoods. The enforcer is the city. And so the way that these community benefits are enforced is through our regulatory process, through a development agreement or through actual zoning. So the same way that we would require any regulatory requirement, like a setback or a height limit or a fire code requirement, that a certain percentage of units that meet an income threshold would be required by regulation. So it would work just the same way as any other city regulation, and the city would be responsible for enforcing these. And we have enforced these agreements in a lot of places around town.
Are there any demands for sustainability in the plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, a broad question. So we have So the question was, are there any recommendations related to sustainability in the plan? And so we have an entire chapter called our Quality of Life chapter, and it's green. And so you can take a look at some of those recommendations. We have a strong emphasis on ways that we can more sensitively manage stormwater. One of the top recommendations that we've heard is to help areas that are deficient of a sufficient tree canopy, to focus on those areas and get more street trees in place. And so these are in particular locations along Colfax and some locations in Cap Hill and North Capitol Hill. But big picture, what I mentioned previously is our growth strategy, where we are recommending growth be focused strategically in locations that have good access to quality transit, is one of the best things we can do long-term for climate change pollution, because it allows two things. One, it encourages more efficient, less polluting transportation in the form of public transportation, walking and bicycling. And secondly, it's been shown that units with shared walls, so think duplexes or multi-unit development, and particularly smaller, are just more energy efficient by design. And so those two things combined can help reduce electricity demand as well as transportation pollution in terms of how the city evolves and grows. And actually, I think there was a map that was presented out, I think, at one of the forums I attended that I hadn't seen before, that shows the density of carbon pollution in the Denver metro area. And it's quite striking that the further you go out in lower density, more car-dependent neighborhoods, much higher carbon pollution per capita is in those locations compared to more of our urban neighborhoods closer to downtown.
There's a proposal to change the definition of household that would allow up to 8 unrelated adults to live in a house. How is the plan addressing that? And how how is the plan addressing parking in what are now single families?
So there is a separate project that's been going on actually for quite some time now that's changing the definition in the zoning code. This is citywide, not just in the East Central area, not just in Congress Park, that changes the definition of single unit. So here's the issue in a nutshell, is the regulations of single unit require people living in that house to be related, right? So you can have, I'm throwing this out there for just illustrative purposes, but you could have 30 today, you have over 30, it's really an unlimited amount of people as long as you're related to them can live in a single family house. So, of course, health codes, fire, all the building codes still come into play. But that's basically what our zoning code says. So there's two problems with that. One is it's perceived to be unfair for some people, right? Why can't two people who are not related live in the same house, right? That's a question that we've heard. Secondly, it's really hard to enforce something like that, right? Like you can imagine us going and knocking on a door and say, hey, we're in government, we need you to take a blood test to prove that you're related to this guy, right? Like, so those are the two real issues with how the zoning code reads. And so basically we're changing that definition to say, okay, we're going to modernize the zoning code and allow people, and frankly, we all know it's happening today, partly because it's unenforceable, right? Unrelated people live in houses all over Denver. And so what we are saying is that we are going to change that definition and put some limits on it. And there's a draft proposal out there. I'm not familiar with all the details, but I can connect you with a planner who's working on it for anyone who wants to dive deeply into this question. The other question related to that, I think, just means with increased population, what's the impact on parking in some of these single unit areas? Well, our single unit zoning is the one zone district in the entire Denver zoning code that has 0 parking requirements. And arguably, it's probably the zoning district that has the most cars, right? So that's the condition today. And so you can imagine, again, it's an enforcement thing. Like, how many of us are guilty of filling up our garages with stuff that's not cars, right? And so if we were going to enforce a minimum parking standard in single unit areas, we would be knocking on doors and telling people to clean out their garages. All right, that's one of the reasons why there's no parking requirements in single unit districts today. There is a parking requirement in duplex, in 2 unit districts. There is an on-site parking requirement. And so some of those, and I should mention that the East Central Plan is not recommending a reduction in parking unless 2 conditions that we've heard, and we're open to conversations about this tonight in other forums. One is, what we've heard, is the very small lots on Colfax, and particularly those lots that people are trying to preserve the buildings and reuse them. Parking requirements can be a major factor in why some of those buildings are very hard to reuse and preserve and change to different uses because it just can't put parking on it. There's no room. Many of those buildings were built when we didn't have parking requirements, right? And so providing some relief from parking standards for those small lots along Colfax is something we're recommending. Aside from that, we're not recommending reducing parking requirements. So the question was, how about underground parking? Underground parking is allowed, right? I don't know if there's a question there, but there's the only thing stopping more underground parking is it's expensive, right? But anyone can do underground parking if they want to.
On the same note around retail, what kind of retail will be required? Would there be another methadone clinic? How are you going to incentivize local retailers to stay?
So this is a big topic that we've heard is locally owned businesses versus sort of the chain development that we've seen. Again, in the statistics that we showed you, most of the new development along Colfax has been national chains. And one of the things that people really love about Colfax in particular, but I think it extends to all of our commercial areas in East Central, is small mom and pop, locally owned businesses. And we've done a survey of all of them in East Central, and about 75% of the businesses along Colfax are independent, so generally small, locally owned businesses. So we have an entire chapter related to small businesses in the plan. Where, tonight we're mostly focused here for land use, but I would encourage you to look at those recommendations. We're proud of those recommendations. We had a lot of engagement from a variety of stakeholders and experts on this question. We hired a national expert to come in and provide us some suggestions on how we can achieve that goal of maintaining small locally owned businesses. It's hard, but there's a variety of ways that we think we can help encourage and preserve that character. And one is related to land use that I'll just touch on, is having a balanced approach to development, a sensitive and balanced approach to development along Colfax. And so we are being very intentional and strategic on what properties that we are identifying for redevelopment. In addition to that, one of the community benefits that we would be asking from developers if they want to be eligible for additional height is providing discounted retail space for locally owned independent businesses in their buildings. So those are two of the land use ways we're accomplishing that. But again, I would encourage you to take, if anyone is interested in this topic, and we're coordinating with the two business improvement districts along Colfax that are on our steering committee, the executive directors, on developing these recommendations, because they are laser focused on this question of trying to preserve businesses and making sure that they're locally owned and moving forward.
How will this plan be able to change over time with change in local leadership, the economy, the climate?
Good question. Everyone hear that? This in planning jargon is called future-proofing the plan, right? And so we don't want to write regulations today. Like, so for example, if we had some big strategy around recycle, that would kind of seem silly in a few years, right? Because I'm sure y'all recognize that recycles can get around too. So things like that of calling out specific current conditions that may not be applicable in the future. And then, so that's one way that we want to make sure that we're not making this plan dated in a few years. The other question was, with changes in political leadership, how will we maintain the plan's integrity over time? And it's important to recognize that when City Council adopts a plan, that then becomes official city policy. And even if a different council member does not like that policy, they're stuck with that policy unless the legislative process is implemented to change that policy. And in plans, that would require a plan amendment. And that has its own community engagement process, hearing process, and frankly, it doesn't happen too often moving forward because there is that process. One thing related to this is that zoning decisions in particular have legal protections, meaning that if a council member wants a different zoning than what is recommended in the plan, that's not allowed by law, right? So zoning must be consistent with an adopted plan by law, or the city could be sued and the developer could be sued moving forward. So that there is a protection in the law today that helps with some of that continuity of plan recommendations moving forward.
We have a question about the bus rapid transit in Colfax. Is there any possibility that it could be located on one side of Colfax instead of down the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a possibility. The decision that has been made up to this point, so the Colfax BRT bus rapid transit project, separate from East Central, has been going on for actually several years now. And the decision from what they call an alternatives analysis, where they weigh different options and different designs generally, and pick one to move forward with, is what they call a center running. And that has a variety of benefits. It's considered a national best practice to have the buses run in the center. So that's the concept that they have right now, but they're moving into a design phase where that could be changed and other details can be changed. And one of the details is station locations. We've heard some recommendations to add stations or adjust locations of stations. They're on that. I think that is definitely something that can be changed at this point in the process. And other sort of design details of how that transit project would fit in.
Could you address the other infrastructure issues? You talked about schools, but how with the increased population, sewer, water, gas, streets, things like that?
Yeah, appreciate it. So another great question, common question is infrastructure capacity issues with development. Obviously, this is something that our department, CPD, is one of the primary agencies that looks at this as we plan for the future and also as we permit development. And so with respect to water and wastewater, sewer, electricity, gas, all of those utilities, generally we have consistent sizes of what we call mains. So these are the underground water and sewer mains in Commerce Park as in other neighborhoods throughout the city. So we have general standard sizes of those mains throughout the city. And every time a site plan or an application comes into the city to get a permit, there's actually a pretty significant fee for many of these utilities. So one example is a tap fee. If you were to build, let's for example, say an accessory dwelling unit, so a separate unit in your backyard, one of the most expensive items from a regulatory process that you'll encounter with trying to build an accessory dwelling unit is your tap fee. And that's the fee that's charged for you to tap into the sewer main, usually in the alley. It's a very expensive fee. And one of the reasons why that's a very expensive fee is we charge that for all development in Denver, and that goes into a fund for maintaining and upgrading that infrastructure citywide. And before you get that permit to tap into the sewer main is checked for capacity. And if there's no capacity in the sewer main, you can't tap into it. And so this can happen from time to time, usually with really dense projects like a high-rise project in downtown Denver, where they're wanting to tap into a sewer main, and the sewer main is at capacity, at least in relation to the high-rise project. And the developer then would need to pay for an upgrade to that line in order to get a permit.
This question has been asked several times. If we have not utilized the existing building heights, why do you support increasing them?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question. So that is one of the reasons that we are not allowing. Thank you. Let me know if any of these questions aren't coming clear. So the question was, if the existing heights and the existing stoning is not being taken advantage of historically and today, why would we contemplate increasing those heights? Right? That was the question. And so that we agree with that. I mean, we do think that there is a market issue with the existing zoning heights today. And again, a lot of these prime development sites are being purchased and not developed to their full capacity. And so that's why that we're establishing this approach is we are not just giving, in quotes, more height away like we normally would in Denver or do close to transit stations. What we are saying is you can only increase height if there's some assurances that you're providing community benefits. That's one of the reasons why we adopted that approach through this process. So basically, you're stuck with your current height unless you can provide some of these community benefits. Okay, so that was the written comments and questions, and now so I'll open up if anyone wants to raise their hand. And I'm gonna, if you have, I don't want to go through a bunch of rules, but if you have a second question, I'm going to call upon everyone else first, so make sure like you ask your questions, your comments, and then if no one else has a question or comment, I'll come back to you if you have a second. So I think you were first. You're the first one I saw. Go ahead.
My question was the community benefits, one slide you showed up there, I'll call it like a lawn or terrace in front of a high-rise building, going from 5 to 8 stories or something. Is that something that's being considered as a community benefit that fall under green space? You know, for children's playground there, I don't know what else. It doesn't look like green space to me.
So the question, and I can maybe find the rendering you're referring to. The question was, is open space one of the community benefits that are being contemplated? And if so, whatever you saw didn't really seem sufficient, right? So yeah, I mean, one of the community benefits that we are recommending is publicly accessible open space. So that would not be something like a courtyard or a small open space in the interior of a private complex. That wouldn't be considered public. That would be considered private. That would be considered publicly accessible. And we're particularly focused really on 2 locations in the East Central area for public open space. Because as you all know, East Central has pretty much some of the best parks in the city today. So a lot of our focus is on how we better connect people to those existing parks. But there are 2 spots that we've identified that are deficient in open space as our Parks Department defines it, and that generally means that it's not within a 10-minute walk of some residences. And that is on the eastern portion of Commerce Park, and in one spot, kind of near Colfax and down. Do you know where the old police station property is on Colfax? Right, so basically right there is where there's also a gap in our walk shed. And so we've actually strategically identified that property because it's a city-owned property as an opportunity for additional open space. And we've identified the surface parking lot south of 13th as part of the National Jewish Hospital as also an opportunity for additional open space. As you know, this area is pretty much built out from a development perspective, so it's pretty hard to identify open space opportunities that don't require demolishing a lot of people's houses or people's property. And so those are the 2 opportunity sites we've identified in this process, and we have a strategy on how we would go about implementing those 2 sites for public open space. Yes.
Just to kind of follow up on that question, why would we give a developer incentives to do green space trails and parks when we as voters passed Measure 2A in 2018 and $46 million a year is going to acquire, develop, and maintain parks? So why would we ever be in a position that we would have to do that? It just seems like we're giving developers incentives for something that we're also paying for too, and we deserve to have the parks that we were told were going to be built as a result of Measure 2A.
Yeah, so just to clarify the recommendation, we actually don't think that the development incentive will be enough to develop a real public park. And so the concept is, can we get a developer or a private property owner to incentivize them to contribute to the open space in partnership with our Parks Department? right? So that it's basically a strategy to try to save some of that, those public funds. So for example, on one of the opportunity sites I mentioned with National Jewish, the strategy would be to incentivize National Jewish to provide a certain percentage of their property as open space, partner with our Parks Department using our Parks Fund to pay for the rest of the open space as well.
I mean, just to kind of follow up with meetings that we had with National Jewish a couple of years ago, you don't need to give them incentives. They would probably do it to be a good partner in the neighborhood because the neighborhood has given them a lot as well. So just, I mean, to constantly put the developers, when we're also paying as taxpayers, it just seems we're paying the sales tax, it's being collected, you know, and the Parks Department gets many grants to build and develop and maintain parks as well. There's a big pool of money.
Right.
And so I'm just saying, I'm more than happy to help you ask National Jewish for that. If that's something that you, with the Parks Department, want to do, because they've said in the past, they've sort of it up as a community garden. I believe they would extend that without any incentive. And so a lot of these things we could get anyway. That's what I feel like, that we're either paying for it or we could get it anyway.
Okay, so I should, on the National Jewish property, we're actually not giving them a height incentive for that. That would be part of our regulatory process. We call it a large development review, where we can ask for open space as a matter of zoning today. So the incentive, if you will, is to partner with us and our Parks Department when they're developing that site going forward. But I think point taken. Yes, sir.
If we have dedicated 2 lanes instead of back for bus rapid transit, does that mean that we don't have to be encouraged?
So the question I'll repeat back is, if there is bus rapid transit in the center of Colfax, does that mean you can't turn left? And so the answer to that is, yes, you will not be able to turn left unless it's at a signal. Right? So all of the signalized intersections, you will be able to turn left. But if there isn't a signal, left turn restrictions will be in place.
I live 1 block off of Colfax, and I think when you had the diagram showing where some of the higher buildings being built on Colfax is within 1 block of where I live, I already can park on some nights, even though we have our own parking permits because we're 1 block from the Bluebird. Is there any way that you can require some of those potentially very tall buildings to have underground parking? Like, it's a requirement.
So if those buildings were being developed at those heights, there would be parking requirements. That's part of the zoning code today. So that is a requirement. There isn't a requirement to force it to go underground, but there is a requirement to provide on-site, on-property parking. I'll go here.
I think it's really informative. Thank you. It's really well done. I just have a question. If you could just talk a little bit more about the transfer of development rights. I didn't quite understand that piece, and I guess I'm just curious if if a building or a location was allowed 8 stories and someone gave them 2 more, does that mean they could go up to 10 without further zoning, or how does that transfer work?
Yeah, great question. So it would only be up to the maximums in the plan. So they would not be able to go higher than that height map is today. But so if it's in one of those, let's just go with a hypothetical example. If you were the owner of, let's say the Taekwondo strip right here in Commerce Park, right? So that's an example of one of the classic Main Street buildings that people have said is valuable. So that's pretty prevalent in the Bluebird area. Those single-story classic Main Street buildings. Most of those are zoned 3 or 5 stories today. And so there's an incentive to redevelop to maximize that over time, right? But that would require tearing those buildings down. So if you're the owner of that property and you wanted to enter into an agreement with an owner of another property in one of those pink areas, right, that is eligible for additional height, and you said, hey, I want to preserve this single-story building, but I want to be able to economically get some value out of my existing zoning. How much would you be interested in purchasing 2 stories? Because I have a 3-story zoning and I want to keep it at 1 story. How would you be interested in purchasing 2 stories? And if there is a developer who has 3 stories today, but they're in a pink area where they can go up to 5 if they provide a community benefit, that would be an example of one of those community benefits. So what we would do is we would downzone the Taekwondo strip area to 1 story and provide a conservation easement on that property. And the community, that would be the community benefit because now you have a historic building preserved. Right, so that's the community benefit box. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say that at the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about how serious the affordable housing situation is in the neighborhood. And that we're, I guess you said 1,500 units short right now, 6,000 that's projected as needed today. I think that's what I saw. And then in the future, that's expected to disappear by another half. So what I want to know is, has planning and community development looked at this plan and determined, okay, say every upzone area that you're looking at right now, from 3 to 5 stories, and from 5 to 8, and 8 to 12, if 20% of that redevelopment was new designated affordable housing, and so many units in the back of the lot, what do you call them?
Accessory buildings.
Accessory units. Are you going to be achieving goals for affordable housing with this plan? And my gut feeling tells me no. And I don't think it's very daring enough to accommodate affordable housing for my 24-year-old, 26-year-old. And that the only thing they're going to be able to afford is a $250,000 to $300,000 one-bedroom condo. Where are they going to be built? My final point is, historically, along 13th and 14th, we have seen 5, 6, and 7-story buildings built. Not recently, but in the 60s and 70s. And they're some pretty interesting looking buildings, especially the one that's painted as a goose. But why not more buildings like that along the avenue and keep the middle of the block as the beautiful buildings that are there now? As an idea to maybe get to reach this goal that supposedly we have for more affordable housing in Palmsville.
I appreciate the question. So I think, just chime in if I'm mischaracterizing it, but there's skepticism with this. So these are the numbers. It's more than what you said. There's 6,000 units needed today. Right? And so if current trends of rising prices, increased population, and not enough income growth, are projected out, that 6,000 number is going to grow. And it's going to grow if we don't do anything about the 1,500 units that will be expiring. So if everything stayed the same, we would at least go up to 7,500 units to our housing shortage if we didn't do anything about those expiring affordable units today. So your question was, are we doing enough from what I laid out today from like a zoning and land use perspective?
Do you think the plan, as proposed today, can meet a goal of providing a certain number of affordable units?
It cannot meet the goal with zoning alone. So I want to be clear about that. This strategy that we've talked about tonight with land use, with asking affordable units as part of community benefits agreements with developers and encouraging smaller units in neighborhoods, That is only one piece of the solution. It is definitely not a silver bullet. And we have a whole chapter in our plan called the affordable housing section of the plan, where there are many other tools and strategies that we need to employ to address this issue. But the question and what we're proposing is, should zoning be part of the solution? Should zoning be one of the tools in the toolbox to help us advance affordability? We think it should, because the issue is such a big issue, and it's something that is really something we've heard over and over and over again throughout this process, and it's a citywide issue, that we think we need every tool in the toolbox to help address this issue, but it will not be accomplished with zoning alone.
It doesn't seem like you're using zoning very much at all in the plan, a few little spots along Colfax. What about historic 5 to 7 story buildings that have been developed along the avenues? Why aren't those more of those?
And we'll take that feedback, and that's one of the questions we're asking by putting out the draft plan is what should change. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have I think a problem with cars speeding in Commerce Park. My wife here as well. Her car was totaled at 14th Colorado by someone who sped through a red light. So I noticed some pictures of traffic calming, and I think traffic can be slowed down only through incredibly intense enforcement or by making it physically impossible to speed. And some of those pictures show things like painted white lines that don't slow down cars. In Boulder, they have, everywhere you go, there's a hump in the road where you're going to go airborne if you don't slow down. Can you address that type of traffic calming, of actually putting raised barriers to slow these people down?
Thank you for that question. Did everyone hear it? Is it related to traffic safety and crashes? So we agree it's a problem. We have data to back it up. Several of the corridors in the East Central area are some of the most dangerous corridors from a crash perspective in the entire city. Many of what we call our high injury network streets are located within the East Central area. I would very much encourage you, if you haven't already, to look at the recommendations in our mobility chapter of the draft plan. We have over 40 transportation safety projects proposed. We've broken them down by short term, meaning the next 5 years, and longer term, more transformative, expensive projects. Working in city planning for 15 years, I'm kind of blown away that our Department of Transportation Infrastructure is making this commitment, just from my perspective. So your question about the specific treatments, paint versus real barriers, I think that's something we want to hear feedback on at this detailed level. And that's why I encourage you to either go in and tell us, hey, like this specific thing that I'm seeing isn't going to help. Here's what I think you should be doing differently. And we read every single comment that comes in. I can chat with you after tonight if you don't want to go into our online document. If you haven't gone into our online document, I would encourage you to. We have about 500 comments in there now, and we're going to read and respond to every single one. Again, if online documents are not your thing, you can tell me in person or write it down tonight. Who had my call on? You in the back.
I'm curious, where does zoning fit into this process right now in terms of the form factor? As related to the plan, we're talking about increasing density and incentivizing ADUs or disincentivizing tearing down. Where's zoning?
So how does zoning fit?
No, are they currently rewriting the code in terms of form standards, the specifics of
So-
mass and bulk and setback?
Right, so what this plan is doing is recommending that zoning projects be done in the future. And so we have several zoning, everyone hear the question? The question was, how does this plan related to zoning and are there zoning projects currently in process? So this project is recommending a variety of zoning projects to be done. So we don't currently have the regulations in the zoning code to accomplish the community benefits idea. So that will need to be a separate project, and that with regulations drafted, benefits analyzed, that project will occur citywide starting this year. And this plan will inform that. Say, okay, if you're going to write regulations to increase height in certain locations for community benefits, then these are the community benefits in Congress Park that are important. And these are the height limits to that project in Congress Park. That's how the East Central Plan will guide that project. There's another project that's being kicked off this year, again, at a citywide scale, to improve design quality in all low-density neighborhoods, so single-unit neighborhoods, and integrate additional smaller units into every neighborhood in Denver. That project is also kicking off this year. And what the East Central Plan will be doing is saying, okay, in Congress Park, this is how that should be implemented, right? And so I gave some examples. You would, because it's historic, you would need to preserve the historic house. You couldn't tear down these, turn-of-the-century bungalows and build a modern duplex. That's not meeting the intent of Congress Park. You would have to preserve the building.
Well, but to follow up on that, I mean, she does in this detail. And based on what you just said about tearing, the current code allows one to remove up to 3% of existing walls on a home before it trips any non-conformance that's treated as a new building. So when you talk about demolition, as we advance this concept, will I be able to modify that existing home to a fairly large extent and still get credit for a initial residence structure? Or in other words, where the tricky.
So, I appreciate that question. The question was, there's a current definition that we use in the building code that distinguishes a new house from a renovation or a remodel. And it's cheaper from a permit perspective to do a remodel. And so you'll see from time to time a house being like sort of torn down and there's like 2 walls. And you're like, why do they keep 2 walls? And that's because of that loophole, what I consider a loophole in the building code, right? So that is not how we would treat this idea, right? So the way that we would enforce this is not through the definitions of a renovation or remodel or a new house in the building code. This would be enforced through the zoning code, and it would require that a house be preserved the same way that a historically designated building is preserved, which means that if you submitted any kind of building permit to the city that would tear down any percentage of that, any percentage at all, or do any modification to that building, it would trigger a review by our landmark preservation staff, and it would have to comply with design guidelines for that neighborhood, and complete demolitions would not be allowed. So that is why, because of that strict regulatory requirement, that is why historic districts, new historic districts and new historic designations generate a lot of discussion, and people have a lot of different opinions about it, right? And that's one of the reasons why we're saying, okay, here's an incentive as an option. If you want to subject your property to that additional layer of regulation and you're actually losing rights to demolish your property that you have today, you can only do that if you're allowed an additional unit. Right? Does that make sense? If you tore down your property, you would lose the right for the additional unit. You wouldn't be able to do that. Is that my?
No, I understand that.
Okay.
But, I don't want to
Okay.
talk to you.
Yes, sir.
In the plan, there are several areas that lead me to think about block rezoning. Specifically, modifications of such current criteria as setbacks, lot coverage, length of 2-story walls, ability to penetrate the building plane. Those have the capacity to fundamentally change the character of the city, of the neighborhood. Can you comment about the block rezoning? The other thing it does is it makes it very difficult for neighborhoods to influence what's built on the site, because essentially it's already been constructed. And the lots in Congress Park are by and large small.
So I think the recommendation that you're referring to is one that I can put back up on the screen. Oh no, these are the mixed use areas. So the recommendation talks about working with neighborhoods to modify zoning standards to better fit the neighborhood. And some of those specific standards you mentioned, bulk plane, building coverage, setbacks, sidewall standards, right? And so those are some of the issues that we've heard that drives that condition of the giant house next to the small bungalow. Because those standards that you pointed out, sidewall length, side setbacks, building coverage, and bulk plane, today in the zoning code in Congress Park allow large houses, like you saw in that image, to be developed in Congress Park. In fact, it incentivizes that because you can get larger, more square footage. So the recommendation is to work with neighborhoods to modify those to better fit the character, which would mean a reduction in building coverage, a reduction in bulk plane, a limitation on height of sidewalls, and an increase in setbacks. Who have that? Yusuf.
Back on your affordable housing, once again on the affordable housing, you said that 1,500 units are expiring. You didn't clarify whether those are rentals or for sale units. And I know this from like Stapleton, they're reaching the end of their affordable. It's like 25 years. They're getting towards the end of it now. Those people are going to have a windfall of like $150,000 to $200,000 when that expires and they sell their unit. So unless Denver owns these units and controls these units, you're never ever going to keep up with the affordable housing need.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, I'm looking back at some of our consultants, I think most of those units today, if not all, are rental units in East Central, right? Yeah, I'm getting the head down. So most of those are rental units, if not all of those in East Central. So a little different condition than there is in Stapleton, where there's a lot of ownership of those affordability restrictions. But your point is a good one, and it's right. It will be difficult for the city to preserve those for long-term affordability. It will require compensating that property owner to keep those rents low in perpetuity, right? So a property owner is not going to voluntarily do that because they're maybe losing money generally. So, yeah, it's a challenge.
My concern about the zoning change is if you have 8 people that are unrelated in the house, I think it's fairly plausible that all 8 of them will have cars, and then they'll be parked on the street. And like, I live on the 600 block of Madison, that would kind of wipe out our parking, just for by like in one house. And also, I'm a little concerned about this encourage high quality design and encourage new development. Encouragement is kind of a milquetoast phrase to say, well, maybe we will and maybe we won't. Am I wrong?
So to the first point about parking and unrelated people living in a single unit house, I don't have a great answer to that, right? So we're not recommending going down the path of requiring multiple parking spaces on a single unit property.
No, they would be parking on the lot.
Right, but the way to mitigate that would be to require people's backyards to be converted into a parking lot, right? So we're not going down that path. And so I think your concern I'm validating your concern. If you're concerned about street parking, with growth and development of the city, there will be some impacts to street parking. Your second comment about the use of encourage is point taken. That's why we're putting out this plan for public review to comment on every word that we're putting out there. we generally use words like guide and encourage and, developers should do this because plans are at what we call a policy level. They're guiding documents. They're not actual regulations. Regulations come later, and this plan guides those recommendations, so that's the reason why some of the language sounds the way it does. Yes, sir.
I understand that the residents in the East Area Plan receive postcards. Are postcards going to be sent to the residents in the East Central Area Plan?
Yeah, so that is accurate. What the issue was, so first of all, as a matter of practice, we do not send out postcards notifying residents that there's a planning process going on. There's really two reasons. One is it's expensive. The second reason is it doesn't work in our experience, that many people just discard their mail as junk mail, and in particular, mostly younger renters and other people like that. It's not the most effective way to notify folks. We made an exception to that in the East Area Plan because one of the reasons was because many of those properties in the East area are single unit properties, and we are recommending changes to single unit properties. And it started to become clear that many of those single unit property owners did not know about our process, even though we were coordinating heavily with all of the RMOs. So in the East Central area, that has not been our understanding of the issue with notification. We have met again with Congress Park neighbors 8 times now. Only a very small portion of the East Central area has single unit zoning today. Most of it is all multifamily, younger people. And as was noted, many of you might have been there. I mean, when we came out to a recent Congress Park meeting over the summer, there was hundreds of people who showed up at that meeting. And so all the indication that we've been seeing is people are aware of this process. And we have done a good job with outreach and partnership with our RMOs in this suburban districts. So that was the reason why we opted not to do that. Yes, sir. I'll call on you after everyone else has gotten a chance. Yes, sir.
Reference is made to giving incentives to developers to increase heights of the story. So these be exclusively financial incentives. Well, not quite. And along with that, so I would go to students a bond that guarantees performance on what we said we're going to do. And the second question has to do with the surveys that we talked about formally. Now, I would like to know at what level of significance the surveys you have taken can be considered, the results of the surveys you have taken can be considered statistically valid.
So I think there was 3 questions there. The first was, are the height incentives only financial incentives? That was the first question. The second question was, would developers be required to post a bond to guarantee what they said they were going to do happens, a performance bond, right? And then the third question is, are the surveys we do in the East Central area statistically significant? At what level of statistical significance? Okay. So the first question is the incentive that's being provided is we don't consider it a financial incentive, even though it is. It's a regulatory incentive, which means that the incentive is you get additional square footage on your property, which is a monetary incentive in exchange for providing that community benefit. So that's the way it works. The second one is, I think, yes, the way we implement these community benefits agreement is a contractual agreement or a regulatory standard in the zoning code, right? So it would be enforced the same way any other regulatory standard works. And when a developer comes in to do an improvement on their property, generally they have to have insurance and performance bonds as associated with any work in the public benefit.
Performance bond, as I understand it, is tax compensation. They don't do the job, they certain bond.
Okay. I'd have to follow up with you on that. I don't know a clear 100% answer at the moment. The third question related to statistically significant survey results. That's not the general practice that we follow with planning processes, is doing statistically valid surveys like they do in the census or some other project. And one of the reasons why we don't follow that process is we're not necessarily asking like a consumer preference question or like what race you are or what income you are that requires a really straightforward answer. What we are asking are things like, tell us what your opinion is about the future of neighborhood character in your neighborhood, and that requires something different than a traditional statistically valid survey. It really requires what we call community engagement, so a conversation like what we're having tonight, instead of just straightforward answers to surveys and then making a determination that everyone agrees upon one thing because we've got statistical significance. I think your point is be careful about who we're hearing from and weighing that in terms of how we're making recommendations. One of the things we do ask when we have our community workshops, or if you comment online on any of our materials, we'll ask a demographic question and we'll ask a geographic question. So we'll say, what neighborhood do you live in? What is your income level? What is your race? We use that data to we compare that demographic data to the actual makeup demographically of the central area. And when we see gaps, we double our efforts to go find those underrepresented demographic groups. One of the most underrepresented demographic groups in our planning process that we had to redirect resources to doing additional engagement with is young renters. We have a huge concentration in the East Central area of young single renters, and almost all of the people that we were hearing from in our participation were homeowners and wealthy and not single. And so we actually partnered with a number of the apartment providers, in particular Cornerstone, which owns a lot of the apartment complexes in East Central, to help us engage their renters, and we got some additional participation that way. Miles, you have a question?
What is the process moving forward with community workshops, and when this is going to go to planning boards and so on?
So, all right, I didn't do that on purpose, Miles. I think the microphone, can everyone hear me? I think the microphone ran out of juice. So the question was, what's the process moving forward tonight? So we have not tonight, but for the plan. So we have the first draft for public comment of the essential plan open online until February 5th. So if you haven't already, we've got about 500 or so comments in there. Please provide comments in there. We really read every single comment that's provided. Once we go through that process after February 5th of reading all of those comments, we will summarize and analyze that input and present it to our steering committee, and that has been tentatively scheduled for February 13th. And so our we'll brief our steering committee on this is what we heard on the draft. Here are some ideas on how we should respond to that community input on the draft. We'll take input from the steering committee on those questions, and then we'll prepare a second draft updated in response to all of that feedback. We will then present that back to the steering committee and ask for an endorsement of the plan, and then that will go through a public hearing process. And our general timeline for public hearings, I'm looking at Scott.
Probably April, May.
Right. April and May would be the second round of the second draft. Oh, thank you. April or May would be the second draft, updated based on community input, that would go through the public hearing process.
Any more community workshops between that period and now?
We don't have any planned unless we're invited, like tonight.
Does Congress Parks still have one meeting that you said you would be willing to do?
I'll say, as we've said throughout this entire process, we will go to every meeting we're invited to. So we have an open invitation, so yes. You in the back.
I just have a couple questions. You're taking a couple ways out of the past, which is great, or bad, however it is. But now you're pushing the traffic off on the other side. Pretty important. Can you models actually look at what the impact of that would be on those areas? And now also you're that there's right. Now you're going to need more people driving through the neighborhoods to be able to make 2 or 3 rights to go across and people are going to go. You start talking about people driving down the streets fast. Now you're pushing more people back into the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Did everyone hear that? Yes, there has been a traffic analysis done as part of the Colfax BRT project. And yes, there will be some displacement of traffic on those parallel corridors, right? And one of the recommendations that we have, and we're actually prioritizing in this plan, is to address that issue. And so that's why we've actually prioritized 13th, 14th, 16th, and 17th, the parallel corridors to Colfax, for traffic calming techniques. So some of that traffic will be, won't be speeding as much through that area. So, but yeah, I mean that is an impact. And if you're interested in the actual details of the specific traffic modeling, there is a website, www.colfaxbrt.org, that has more information about those traffic models. Yes, sir.
So in contemplation of this question, as well as the question around the vehicles that belong on cars, if I was looking at the chart directly in the back, over time, the anticipation with the changes in sort of structure of our community, that there will be more diversity in the way that people are transporting themselves. On MRT, on bike lanes, it's a lot more diversity, so that people can get around more effective solution, less traffic. Can you provide some clarity on that?
Yeah, I mean, so it makes intuitive sense that, so the question was, as the community changes to smaller units and more multimodal transportation infrastructure, shouldn't that affect travel behavior and car ownership? I think is kind of the gist of what you're saying.
So within the chart in the back, it implies that there's a diversity in transportation. The 2 questions and the way that you answered them sort of conflict with that. So I was trying to get some clarity around, is it going to be that there's going to be more traffic to be pushed in the community, which makes it more dangerous for such
I got you. Yeah.
and people in the community? Or is it that there will be more diversity in sort of transport and more safety? I just wanted some
Right. So I'll answer it in 2 ways. One is we do see a relationship in car ownership and people opting for things like walking, biking, and transit when walking, biking, and transit infrastructure is better, and when small units are located close to those services or close to jobs and other amenities. So basically, mixed-use walkable neighborhoods drive less and generally have less car ownership, and that's seen throughout the country, right? And so when you make those changes, in particular the infrastructure, we do see a shift in modes, right? And so that's one of the goals we have in this plan. With respect to traffic increasing because of the reconfiguration of the lanes on Colfax, much of the traffic that's going on Colfax and those parallel corridors today don't live in the central neighborhood. Those are suburban commuters for a lot of part, and they're traveling quickly. This is where the speeding issue comes into play. They're trying to get to their destination fast or avoid rush hour traffic jams, and so they're speeding through these areas, and they don't actually live in the neighborhood. And so as, some of them, I'm not saying all, I'm generalizing, right? And so that's why we, at a citywide level, are trying to manage growth more strategically, because as you develop out the perimeter of the city, Aurora, for example, it's likely that traffic will increase because Denver is the largest employment center in the state. And so people are going to go to it, right?
My information, isn't that the point of the bus route is transit? It's coming from Aurora, are able to use an alternative to work downtown, and for affordable housing, folks are forced to live outside of Denver, or now living towards another Denver, so there is. I'm just trying to.
So the traffic model that I mentioned in the last question doesn't just predict everyone will shift to the side streets. It predicts some people will actually opt to take the bus rapid transit because it's a better service and more reliable and predictable. Like if you know, for example, if you live in Aurora and you work downtown, and in today's conditions, you're unsure how long it's actually going to take you if you have to get to work at normal times. So a lot of people will leave their house 30, 40 minutes earlier than they have to get to their job because they don't know if they're going to get stuck in traffic. So what we're seeing in that condition in a lot of cities around the country is when you provide a reliable and predictable way to get to work, right? So because the Colfax BRT will not be impeded by rush hour traffic, you have a very much more clear understanding of how long it's going to take you to get to work. And that causes mode shift. Plus, it can be hard to park downtown and all those other factors. So the traffic model that the BRT did say some of those trips will actually go on the BRT. Some trips will prefer to stay, and there will be some increase on the side streets. I should say, from memory, and I'm not totally sure about this, but about a third of the traffic on the traffic model would go to other parallel streets. And so that may sound like a lot, but it's actually a third across all of the parallel streets. And so what the traffic model predicted was that no one individual street will is actually showing an increase by more than 10%. Okay, so we're going to kick out. It's 8 o'clock. We are, thank you so much for showing up and your engagement, and we'll